My name is Isaac, and for the last few years I thought I was living a quiet, successful life.
Prussian.
I am 34, an industrial design consultant, spending my days sketching prototypes and ensuring safety gear meets the highest standards.
Vase.
It is boring, steady work, but it paid for the house, the car, and the comfortable life I shared with my wife Vanessa. Vanessa, however, always made it clear that boring was a synonym for failure in her vocabulary. She constantly complained that I was too predictable, too stable, and that my life lacked the fire she so desperately craved.
Friend.
Her best friend Betty was always there to fan the flames, acting like a social media commentator who lived her life for an audience that wasn't there.
Beast.
Betty would nod, record her voice notes, and tell Vanessa, girl, you deserve a man who lives on the edges, not a man who calculates stress loads for a living.
You're right.
I tried to be the husband she wanted, even if I didn't know how to play the role of a risk taker. One Tuesday, I left work early, stopping at a Thai place to pick up the extra crispy noodles she always obsessed over.
Yunwen.
I thought maybe today we could sit on the patio and find a way back to the people we were before the tension started.
Pheasant.
I pulled into the driveway at 11:30, and the first thing that hit me was the silver sedan parked 4 houses down. It was my father's car.
Vehicle. Better than my own.
He had just finished detailing it, obsessing over the finish, like he was preparing for a competition.
Thing.
He didn't park in front of our house, he parked just far enough away to maintain a pathetic veneer of discretion.
You.
My father had always been a hovering presence in our lives, a man who couldn't stop himself from fixing things that didn't need his attention. He showed up uninvited. He doted on our 3-year-old son, Owen, with a strange intensity, often making comments about the boy's eyes that made my skin crawl. Standing there on the sidewalk, looking at that cold engine, a feeling of deep, sick dread settled into my marrow. I walked up the driveway, the front door unlocked, the house unnervingly silent.
Fixed.
The television was humming in the living room, but the volume was turned down so low it sounded like a ghost whispering. On the coffee table sat 2 mugs.
Things.
One was stained with Vanessa's signature, dark red lipstick. The other was pristine and untouched. I didn't call out. I didn't make a sound, because some part of me already knew what was waiting upstairs.
Thing.
As I moved toward the staircase, the silence was broken by a soft, melodic sound that I recognized instantly.
It was.
Vanessa's breathy laugh, the one she only saved for intimate moments, followed by the low, gravelly rumble of my father's voice. My heartbeat became a hammer against my ribs, each thud deafening in the stillness of the hallway.
You bought.
I pushed open the bedroom door, and the floor didn't just feel like it was disappearing. It turned into an abyss. My father was half-clothed, his hands roaming over my wife's body with a terrifying, practiced familiarity.
Fig you they?
Weren't. Startled. They looked at me with the cold, detached gaze of people who had been caught doing something they felt entitled to.
Fruits.
Vanessa scrambled to cover herself. Her face flushed, but my father simply stood up, smoothing his shirt with an irritating, calm arrogance.
Fin.
He looked at me, not with shame, but with the annoyed expression of a man whose business meeting had been interrupted by a nuisance.
Frogson. We need to sit down.
He commanded, as if he were holding a board meeting, not destroying his own son's life. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply turned around and walked out, my body functioning on a cold mechanical autopilot.
Followed.
They followed me to the dining table, sitting on the opposite side, presenting themselves like a united corporate front. Dot! Vanessa's voice trembled, but it was hollow scripted.
Thing it gets.
Not what you think. There is history here. We were close long before I met you. She started. I looked at them, my voice sounding like it was coming from a different room, and asked, "Are you sleeping together?"
Inside scenes.
What's up, Reddit? My father didn't hesitate, meeting my gaze with a chilling confidence. It's more than that. We are in love, and we were hoping you could be mature about this.
Felt.
I felt something snap. Deep inside me, a silent detonation of everything I had ever believed about family and loyalty.
False.
Vanessa chimed in, trying to play the victim. We didn't want to hurt you. We wanted to keep things stable for your sake.
Fingered.
My father leaned forward, unfolding a plan he had clearly orchestrated in his mind, treating my life like a manufacturing project.
Fingy.
But we separate our private lives this. keeps the peace and maintains stability for young Owen, he said.
Feuds.
He even smiled, a smug, satisfied expression, clearly believing he was solving a problem rather than committing a moral atrocity.
You might.
He thought he could manage me, just like he had managed my mother for 18 years, just like he had managed every aspect of my life. I stood up, and for the first time in my life, I looked at him not as a father, but as a predator I had finally identified. I am not a part of your design, and I am not a problem. You can fix, I said, my voice steady for the first time.
Fanged.
I walked out of the house, leaving them sitting there with their logical solution, and headed straight to my friend Lucas' place.
Frying.
Lucas listened to the entire story, his jaw tight, his hands forming fists, and he told me the only thing that mattered. You don't get angry, Isaac. You get documentation. And then you get a lawyer.
Few months were a masterclass in calculated retribution. Dot.
I quietly gathered every text, every time-stamped photo of his car, and I hired a private investigator to dig into their history.
Found.
Was worse than the affair. They had been siphoning my joint savings into a private account for years, preparing for an escape.
E.
When the day finally came for the family assembly, they thought I was there to discuss the terms of our arrangement.
Faced.
I walked into the living room, where my entire extended family was gathered, Vanessa, and my father looking smugly expectant. I didn't say a word, I just hit the play button on the tablet connected to the living room speakers.
You.
It was audio of them planning the theft of my accounts, followed by the confession of their affair, recorded the very day I caught them. The silence that filled the room was not the silence of my home, but the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. My father's face, drained of color, his ego collapsing in real time, as my family stared at him with absolute disgust.
Things.
Vanessa tried to speak, but the look on her mother's face stopped her dead in her tracks. I didn't need to say a word, I just handed the legal documents to my lawyer, who stood by the door with a stack of papers ready for service.
Legion.
We sued for everything, the money, the house, and full custody of Owen, using their own words as the primary evidence.
Thin.
The court case was quick and brutal for them, as the judge did not look kindly on a father-in-law and daughter-in-law scheme.
Being.
Vanessa lost everything, ending up in a small, cramped apartment, while my father was ostracized by the only community he ever cared about. I got everything back, but more importantly, I got my freedom.
Didn't adapt to their sick world.
I burned it to the ground and built something new from the ashes. Justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cold, precise, and entirely final.
Today.
I watch Owen play in the yard, and for the first time I don't feel like I'm looking at someone else's child. I am the man who protects him, and that is all that matters.
Fingju.
The boring life I once lived is gone, replaced by a clarity that only comes when you stop hiding from the truth. I finally realized that the only person who can define your worth is yourself.
Music.
They thought they could manage my life like a product, but they forgot one thing. I am the one who designs the future. And as for them, they are just a mistake in the prototype phase, permanently discarded.
Easing. The air in the room was thin, icy, and suffocating.
I found myself gasping, trying to pull oxygen into lungs that felt like they were collapsing under the weight of a sudden, brutal truth.
4 o'clock.
I had navigated my way to my best friend Lucas. House my hands trembling so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I poured everything out to him, every jagged detail, every horrifying realization.
50.
Lucas sat perfectly still, listening without a single interruption, his jaw clamped shut until the muscles stood out like iron cables.
Thanksin.
When I finally finished, he looked at me, his eyes cold and clinical, and told me that we had to start building our fortress immediately.
Fiction.
I needed a lawyer, and I needed to safeguard my world before they could rewrite the history of what happened. Lucas spent his days in risk management. He saw life as a series of threats and strategic mitigations.
Beat.
Right then, that was the only language I could speak. I spent that entire night slumped on his couch, eyes wide open staring at the ceiling, while every memory I had foolishly ignored played back on an endless agonizing loop.
Remote.
The next morning, I reached out to my mother, my voice tight as I told her I needed 20 minutes of her time. It was about Dad.
Beansadet.
When I arrived at her home and laid out the reality of the betrayal, the color drained from her face, leaving her ghost white before a volcanic rage took over. She shouted that he had betrayed her, and now he was doing the same to me, and she reached for her phone to call him immediately. I stopped her, my grip firm on her wrist.
Fond.
I explained that a reckless reaction now would only hand him the ammunition he needed to paint me as the unstable one, the villain in his narrative. I refused to let him hold the reins of this story for 1 second longer.
He asked what she could do, how she could help.
I gave her clear instructions. No messages, no back and forth negotiations, and if anyone reached out, direct them to me.
Phase, I added.
That if he dared to show up at her doorstep, she was to keep the door locked and ignore him entirely. Then I looked her in the eyes and said the truth that neither of us wanted to admit out loud.
Feel a shred of guilt, Mom.
He only feels like he's been inconvenienced by us finding out. Her expression hardened, the shock replaced by a painful, sharp recognition.
Eason.
Before I walked out the door, she apologized for failing to protect me from him all these years. I told her that wasn't her burden to carry anymore. This time, I was the one protecting myself.
Frightened.
Throughout the following week, Vanessa and my father sent a barrage of messages. They were long, manipulative essays about how we just needed to sit down and talk, how they understood.
Meaning no.
I was feeling hurt and how a real family could overcome anything if we just acted with maturity. I didn't answer a single one. I saved everything. The screenshots, the timestamps.
Forwarded.
Every last bit of that digital trail to Lucas. Lucas delivered on his promise and brought in Patterson, a shark in the world of family law, a man known for tearing through cases with surgical precision.
Friday.
I brought the entire Everyth timeline, the messages, the wreckage of my life. Patterson leafed through it, his face neutral, before delivering two hard truths.
First.
The house was strictly mine. It had been purchased before the marriage, and my prenup was ironclad. Second. He insisted I needed a paternity test. That second point hit me like a sledgehammer to the ribs.
Ew.
I had been shoving that thought into the darkest corner of my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but Patterson laid it out with chilling logic.
The timeline.
The way my father hovered around, little Owen, the offhand comment, Sid all pointed toward a reality. I was terrified to verify. He told me I needed absolute certainty.
Prison.
I went back to Lucas' place that night, drifting in and out of a restless, feverish sleep. I kept replaying every moment it'd spent with Owen. He was 3 years old, obsessed with model trains and plastic dinosaurs.
He called me Data.
He looked at me with an adoration that made me feel like I was the center of his universe.
Feed.
I remembered how he'd instinctively reach for my hand whenever we crossed the street, or how he'd curl up on my chest, fast asleep while we watched movies. These moments felt so heavy with love, so profoundly real, at least they had to me. The boy even had my eyes.
Fizu.
The next morning, I took Owen to a private pediatric clinic under the guise of a routine checkup, secured the DNA sample, and rushed it to a lab Patterson trusted. Paid a premium for express processing, and sent a second independent sample to another facility just in case. Meanwhile, Vanessa was posting incessantly on social media. New beginnings. Living my truth.
Reason.
Strong women don't apologize for wanting more. Betty, her best friend, was stuck to the comment section like a leech fueling the fire with praise. You're glowing. This is your season. Real ones know. It made my stomach churn with such intensity. I almost hurled my phone against the wall. I saved every single post. 8 days later, Patterson called. There was no fluff, no easing into the blow. Owen wasn't mine.
Fix. 0% probability.
The second lab confirmed the devastating result 2 days after that.
Ego that.
I sat in my car in the quiet office parking lot, staring at the document until my knuckles turned bloodless against the steering wheel.
Reese.
I was trying to process the fact that my own father hadn't just betrayed me, he had tried to replace me in my own life. I had spent 3 years raising his son believing he was my legacy.
Vipers.
The midnight feedings, the first steps of every single milestone, was built upon a mountain of lies. I drove to a remote, empty park and sat on a bench, watching the sky bleed into dark, heavy gray.
Thought about Owen's first words. Data. I.
I thought about the hours I spent teaching him to stack blocks, the way his tiny fingers gripped mine when he was finding his balance.
Felt every ounce of that felt like a beautiful, living memory.
None of it was mine to claim. For 1 hour, I allowed myself to fully break. I felt the theft, the violation,
The agony of having 3 years of fatherhood.
ripped away by two people who had sat across the table from me, day after day, watching me live the lie they had orchestrated. Then I dialed Lucas and told him everything.
Fade.
He remained silent for a long, heavy moment before saying, we needed to meet in Personi shouldn't be alone. We met at a diner, a neutral ground where the noise of the world couldn't reach us. Lucas asked me what I wanted to do.
Told him everything.
Paternity fraud. Divorce. Full-scale scorched earth. I was finished with the silence.
Feed.
He warned me to take one night to be absolutely certain, because once I pulled this trigger, there was no turning back. I told him I'd been sure since the very moment I opened that bedroom door and saw the truth for what it was.
Abuse.
Now, I was making mine. But first, I needed to look Vanessa in the eye and let her know that the charade was over. That night, I sent her a message.
You met.
I told her I'd be over the next day to collect a few things and have a conversation.
From it.
She responded. Almost. Instantly, sounding desperate and eager she had been waiting for me to reach out. She missed me. Maybe we could work something out. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reply.
Vixon.
The next afternoon, Lucas accompanied me. Vanessa opened the door looking as though she'd been prepping for a reunion hair-styled makeup. Perfect, a practiced, fragile smile on her face.
He tried to invite me to talk in private.
But I told her Lucas was staying. This wasn't a conversation for just the two of us. We sat in the living room while Owen was at daycare, right where I wanted him far away from the toxicity.
You.
I told her. The DNA results were back. I told her. Knew I the truth about Owen. I told her. I knew exactly who his father was. Her face didn't just pale. It turned the color of ash.
Feed.
She started talking, her voice, a frantic, high-pitched blur. She could explain it. Wasn't lint. What I thought we could fix this. And then she whispered the words that finally broke the last thread of my pity for her.
Wouldn't tell anyone.
That stopped me dead in my tracks. You're not scared of losing me, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. You're only scared that people will finally know who you are.
Be that.
She opened her mouth, closed it, and had nothing left to say. I stood up, towering over the ruins of my marriage. I told her my lawyer would be in touch with the papers. She had 30 days to vacate my house.
Single thing was missing or damaged, I would come for her with everything the law allowed. Dot.
She began to sob, clutching at me, saying she never meant for things to end like this, that she still cared for me.
Fusion.
I looked down at her and felt nothing. Her feelings were no longer my problem. She had made her bed, and now she would learn to lie in it. Lucas and I walked out the door and into the cool air.
Fune once up.
We didn't say a word in the car, and we didn't need to. That night, I called Patterson and gave him the order to file it all. Justice was finally on its way. The weight of her emotions was no longer a burden I carried.
Bro.
She had paved her own path with the choices she made, and now she would have to walk it alone. Lucas and I walked out of that house in a silence, so thick it felt tangible.
Conversation.
Was necessary. The betrayal was already written in the air between us. That very night, I reached out to Patterson and gave him the order to initiate everything.
Divorce charges of paternity fraud.
And the immediate removal of my name from that birth certificate. The full weight of the legal hammer was coming down.
Feed.
Patterson offered a grave warning that this would turn into a bloodbath of litigation. Vanessa would fight tooth and nail, and my father was bound to crawl out of the woodwork to interfere.
Thing.
I looked him dead in the eye and told him I didn't care how messy it got. I wasn't the one who had spent 3 years living a lie, so I had nothing to fear from the truth.
Thing.
Patterson promised he would have the mountain of documents ready for filing by week's end. The first person to show a crack in their armor wasn't Vanessa, but her sidekick Betty.
I had confronted Vanessa about the reality of Owen's heritage.
Betty appeared at my mother's house. I have no idea how she managed to track down that address. And frankly, I didn't care.
At 8 in the morning, Pull showed up at 8 in the morning, putting on a sickening display of feigned concern.
She claimed she just wanted to check on me, insisting that Vanessa was worried and suggesting we all sit down like civilized people.
Fabian,
My mother called me immediately, her voice steady, asking if I wanted her to handle the intrusion. I told her yes, and I heard the satisfaction in her voice as she hung up to deal with the guest. She marched outside and told Betty on certain terms that her presence was no longer welcome. She made it clear that this was family business and that Betty had never been and would never be family.
Uzub,
She warned her that if she stepped foot on the property again, it would be met with charges of harassment. Betty tried one last time to pull the sympathy card, rambling about Vanessa's struggle and how everyone makes mistakes.
Ichu,
My mother cut her off, stating that Vanessa could struggle with her poor choices on her own time, but she needed to leave my property immediately. Betty left, but the spiteful nature of her character shone through an hour later. He posted a vague, pathetic status on social media about toxic families holding grudges and the sanctity of supporting friends. I took screenshots of every word, saved them, and waited.
Vanessa had finally dropped
The perfect wife mask and shifted into a full-blown victimrent mode. She talked about betrayal, about personal growth, and about standing in your truth.
Use.
And of course, Betty was right there in the comments, cheering her on like a loyal soldier. Own your story, they wrote. They can't handle your power while the world looked on.
Him.
Lucas pointed out that every single one of those posts was just more evidence for the pile. Patterson confirmed that he had already begun archiving her entire social media feed.
Fees up.
Then, my father tried to insert himself into the narrative with his own brand of cowardice. But he showed up at my office, and the reception desk called up to tell me he was waiting in the lobby.
Unig.
I told them to send him packing, as I no longer had a father in my life. An hour later, he sent an email, a long, winding mess of nonsense about how he never intended to cause me pain.
Venif.
He talked about how emotions aren't always convenient, and how blood is supposedly thicker than water. I forwarded the entire pathetic document to Patterson without even bothering to reply.
Usine.
The very next morning, the divorce papers were served to Vanessa by a formal courier. They were clean, cold, and legally absolute. Patterson had included everything:
Fusion.
the adultery, the paternity fraud, and a strict notice to vacate the premises within 30 days. He also attached the deed, showing I was the sole owner of the property and the prenup that protected my premarital assets.
Finby.
16 times that day, leaving 11 voicemails, each one more frantic and unhinged than the last. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "My lawyer says this isn't legal. You're destroying our family."
Figs.
I didn't answer. A single one. I just saved them all as proof of her desperation. That night, my cousin Julie called, her voice full of genuine concern.
Vint.
She and I had always been close, and she said the family grapevine was working overtime with rumors. I gave her the short, painful version of the truth.
You.
She told me that if I needed a place to hide or a shoulder to lean on, she was there. 3 days later, the entire tide turned in our favor.
You get.
One of Betty's own friends from their private group chat, a woman I had never even met, reached out to Lucas. She had been in the chat when Betty accidentally posted a screenshot of their strategy session.
Thinks you.
Betty had deleted it within minutes, but this woman had seen the red flags and grabbed a copy first. She sent Lucas the full damning image. The screenshot was everything I had dared to hope for and more.
Finkson.
It was Betty and Vanessa planning exactly how to spin the narrative to paint me as the villain. They discussed what to post, who to contact, and how to make me appear unstable to everyone we knew. Betty had written, "Get ahead of this post about emotional abuse, plant the seeds early." Vanessa had asked, "What about the paternity thing?" And Betty had replied that never goes public, keep it vague. Lucas sent the files to me, and I sent them directly to Patterson. Patterson called me within the hour, his voice buzzing with excitement.
You.
"This is gold," he said. "This is proof of collusion, deceit, and manipulation that will hold up in every single hearing." Betty had no idea we held the smoking gun.
He was still busy
Playing the loyal best friend in the comment sections of Vanessa's posts. Patterson waited almost a week before he decided to spring the trap, letting Betty continue to chirp while she dug her own grave.
Thanks.
Then he sent her lawyer a letter. It wasn't about the screenshot. It was a polite, devastating summary of her civil liability for interference with my marriage.
Feuds.
He mentioned the coaching of deception and the high probability of a subpoena for her digital records. The very next day, Betty's lawyer called Patterson, his tone significantly less arrogant than before.
You.
Betty wanted to cooperate, claiming she had been manipulated by Vanessa and that she had only wanted to help a friend in need. Over the next few days, her lawyer sent over a cooperation statement filled with excuses.
Feud.
Once Patterson had her pathetic story in writing, he finally sent her lawyer the screenshot we had been holding. The reaction was immediate and absolute silence.
Fusey.
It was a long, heavy silence followed by a defeat to revise our position. The next day, a new statement arrived, and this time it was the raw, unvarnished truth. Yes, she had known the truth about Owen.
He had strategized every move.
Yes, she had coached Vanessa on how to hide the paternity issue while painting me as the aggressor.
Fanny.
The full collapse of her ego took nearly 2 weeks, but watching her scramble to save herself was worth every second. I told Patterson to hold on to everything. Betty had never cared about anyone but herself.
It.
Meanwhile, Vanessa posted a final polished growth statement. It was full of buzzwords about mistakes healing and protecting her son, but zero accountability. I didn't bother responding to her public circus.
X.
Instead, I wrote one simple factual paragraph and sent it to every member of our family. I laid it out. Vanessa had engaged in an affair with my own father. The paternity testing had confirmed that Owen was not my son. Divorce proceedings were finalized, and all questions should be directed to my attorney. I sent it to my mother, my aunts, my uncles, and my cousins.
I turned my phone off
and went to the gym to let the adrenaline work its way out. Lucas texted me later that evening telling me my mom had handled it with quiet, devastating efficiency.
Bang same.
The response from the family was overwhelmingly in my favor, and the truth had cleansed the air. My father had already been uninvited from every upcoming gathering, though some still clung to their delusions.
Victim.
2 days later, my Uncle Rich, my father's younger brother, arrived at my office insisting on a talk. I allowed him into my office, and he sat down to launch into a sanctimonious speech about family privacy.
Using.
He talked about the virtue of forgiveness and how I was the one tearing the family apart by speaking the truth. He claimed my mother was being too harsh and that I needed to show maturity by sweeping this under the rug.
Thing.
Sat there, letting him finish his entire pathetic monologue, my face completely neutral. I looked at him, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lifting and prepared to deliver the final blow. I sat there, watching him speak, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking.
He was lecturing me again,
weaving a tapestry of family privacy and forgiveness as if he hadn't just shattered the foundations of my entire existence.
Thing.
He spoke about how I was the one tearing the family apart, claiming that my mother was being too harsh and that I as a man needed to show more maturity. I didn't say a word.
Thinged.
I just watched his lips move, realizing that for the first time in my life, I could see the strings attached to his every word.
Thicked.
When he finally paused, waiting for my submission, I simply stood up, walked to the door, and swung it wide open.
Privacy is for families, I said.
My voice cold as ice. I'm done protecting yours.
Feud.
He tried one last attempt to condescend, muttering about how I was too young to understand the complexity of the situation. I didn't argue.
Few.
I just stood by the door staring at him until the silence became heavy enough to suffocate him. He left, but the war was far from over.
Speak.
That weekend, Vanessa, my soon-to-be ex-wife, showed up at the apartment where I'd been staying with my friend Lucas.
He was banging on
the door, sobbing, claiming that Betty had given her terrible advice and that she just wanted to fix things. Lucas opened the door, looked at her with pure disdain, and didn't even invite her in.
We are discussing paternity fraud and adultery,
he said, his voice flat.
We aren't discussing your feelings.
He slammed the door in her face. She stood outside wailing for 10 minutes, waiting for me to crack. I didn't move.
Few.
Lucas turned to me and said, "She's not crying because she's sorry. She's crying because she knows she's losing." By the end of the month, Vanessa had cleared out her belongings.
She didn't trash the place, but she took everything of value. Dot.
I changed the locks the moment her car pulled out of the driveway. My attorney Patterson informed me that our first hearing was scheduled within 8 weeks.
Feasance.
Vanessa's legal team was already aggressive, pushing for massive alimony and child support while simultaneously fighting to contest the paternity test. Dot used everything I told him.
Fainsio.
Every screenshot, every timestamp, every conversation. In court, her lawyer tried to have the results tossed, claiming I had obtained the samples without proper consent,
Stood there.
pointing at me, arguing that Owen the boy I had raised as my son deserved stability and that removing me as his legal father would be a trauma he couldn't recover from. Patterson didn't raise his voice.
He simply dismantled them.
He proved. The samples were legally obtained, and that Vanessa had been committing fraud for 3 years. Owen has a right to know his true origin. Patterson argued, his voice echoing in the courtroom. A stability built on a foundation of lies is nothing more than a ticking time bomb. The judge agreed, ordering a court-mandated second test. The result remained the same, 0%, but the battle took a strange, dark turn.
Fangs.
The judge raised the issue of equitable estoppel legal doctrine, suggesting that, because I had acted as a father for 3 years, I might still be on the hook for support regardless of the biology.
Felt like the world was collapsing again.
Dot. Vanessa's lawyer jumped on it, arguing that the bond I had with Owen was the only thing that mattered. Dot. Patterson, however, played our ace. He filed a mountain of evidence.
Fair. Timeline.
The explicit messages between Vanessa and my father, and the coordination with Betty to keep the lie alive. He argued that fraud voids everything. He showed the court how Vanessa hadn't confessed but had been caught red-handed. My name was ordered off the birth certificate. My legal obligations were terminated. The judge made it clear. The ruling was based entirely on the depth of Vanessa's deception. Vanessa tried to cry in court, begging for fairness, but the judge didn't deal in tears, she dealt in facts. You created this tragedy, the judge told her.
Thing. You cannot demand support from a man you systematically betrayed. My father,
the man who had orchestrated this betrayal by sleeping with his own son's wife, didn't show his face at a single hearing. He let her drown alone.
Fair.
A week later, he tried to buy his way out. His lawyer sent an offer, $25,000 for a signed NDA.
Dot.
Complete silence. No mention of the affair, no mention of the fraud, no contact with the family. Patterson read the offer to me and asked what I wanted to do. I laughed a sharp, bitter sound. Tell him the truth. Isn't for sale, I replied. Patterson smiled and tucked the offer away. This is now evidence of guilt, he noted.
If he tries anything else, we have him by the throat.
Meanwhile, my mother was a rock. She didn't need drama, she just told the truth.
He cheated on me.
He gaslit me, and now he's done it to his own son. She would tell anyone who asked. People believed her because they had seen him do it before. When my aunt bumped into him at the market, she didn't mince words.
Bessie, you are a coward, she said, cutting him off mid-excuse.
There is nothing complicated about destroying your own family for a moment of pleasure. Within weeks, he was a pariah.
Things.
Read it? He was uninvited from every holiday, every birthday, every gathering. But he wasn't done. He made one last move, a desperate attempt to ruin my career. He called one of my biggest clients posing as a concerned family member,
For suggesting I was having a mental breakdown
and that my work might be suffering. The client called me directly, confused by the call. I remained calm. My father and I are estranged. I told him, keeping my tone professional.
He is doing this to hurt me.
My work speaks for itself. The client apologized, admitting the call felt off. I sat in my office stunned by the sheer level of malice.
Wasn't
just an affair. This was an attempt to control me even as his own world burned down. I called Patterson again. We sent a cease and desist letter that afternoon with a warning that any further interference would result in a lawsuit for tortious interference. Dot! He went silent after that. Vanessa's online life, once a parade of perfect photos.
usual.
had devolved into posts about single motherhood and adversity, with Betty still cheering her on in the comments. They could have their fake lives. I had my truth. For the first time in 3 years, I could finally breathe. The air in the sterile conference room was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Vanessa's curated online persona had completely collapsed under the crushing reality of her own making. Gone was the influencer life, the filtered perfection, and the staged happiness.
Dang it.
Her recent posts were desperate, messy attempts to garner sympathy through tales of struggle, single motherhood, and unearned adversity.
Vent.
Betty, ever the loyal sidekick, hovered in the comments section attempting to gaslight the public into believing Vanessa was the victim, but nobody was buying the narrative anymore.
Fusion.
The public had seen the screenshots, the timestamps, and the cold, hard proof of her betrayal. Within a week of the backlash, she had locked her accounts, retreating into a silence that felt like a burial.
Fiend.
7 months after I filed for divorce, the legal battle finally reached its conclusion. Vanessa had dragged her feet, filing endless, pointless motions, desperately clinging to the hope that she could stay in my house.
Thing.
Patterson, my lawyer, dismantled every single one of her attempts with a clinical precision that bordered on art.
Dot.
In the final settlement, she walked away with nothing.
No alimony. No leverage, only the consequences of her own choices.
Soon after, my father reached out one last time.
He sent a letter filled with platitudes about blood being thicker than mistakes, hoping we could reconcile.
I read the letter, once felt nothing but a cold, detached clarity, and then burned it in the fireplace.
Beast.
I sent one final message to his number. You stopped being my father. The moment you decided to sleep with my wife.
Blood
means nothing when it's poisoned. Then I blocked every single line of communication he had.
You bet.
Lucas asked if I felt guilty for severing ties so completely, but I told him the truth. Guilt is a luxury for those who still care. And I didn't care anymore. Months later, I met Rachel.
Phew.
She was a project manager at one of our manufacturing clients, a woman who lived in the real world rather than on a screen. She was smart, funny, and refreshingly devoid of drama.
Fence.
We took our time building something quiet and stable, away from the wreckage of my past. Midhaunt, when I finally told her the truth about Vanessa and my father, she didn't flinch. She simply looked at me, acknowledged the baggage, and chose to stay. Meanwhile, my life began to resemble a home again.
Promoted.
My work life flourished, and my house felt like a sanctuary rather than a museum of mistakes. Yet there were ghosts. Owen remained a constant, silent presence in my heart.
You.
I would see children his age at the park, and my chest would tighten with a grief that never quite faded. Some nights I would lie awake, remembering the way he laughed at my dinosaur impressions.
Fiend.
The way he squeezed my hand and the phantom weight of him in my arms. Rachel was patient, even when she realized that my grief for my son was a room she couldn't fully enter.
He asked me once if I would ever try to see him. And
I told her the truth. He deserved better than to be a pawn in his mother's web of lies. Maybe when he was old enough to discern the truth, we could find a way.
Fiend, but not now.
Not while his foundation was built on sand. By the following spring, I proposed to Rachel in the quiet of our patio.
He said yes.
And for the first time in years, the future felt like a promise rather than a threat. But, just as we began to plan, the past decided to claw its way back into our lives.
Use up Reddit.
Vanessa reached out not through social media but through Patterson. She wanted closure. She wanted a meeting.
Patterson warned me.
But my curiosity, or perhaps my need for a final definitive period at the end of this sentence, won out. I told him to set it up.
Phew.
Before the meeting, Vanessa tried to poison the well once more by messaging Rachel, claiming I had manipulated the narrative. Rachel showed me the message, laughed, and blocked her without a word. The meeting took place on a rainy Saturday in Patterson's conference room. Vanessa looked a ghost of her former self, hair shorter. No makeup, eyes hollowed out by her own choices.
Thanked.
My father looked even worse, grayer, thinner, a man who had finally realized that his betrayal had cost him his only son. Patterson established the ground rules. 30 minutes, no negotiations, no counseling.
Finked.
Vanessa went first, her voice shaking as she claimed she was working on herself, that she was sorry. I didn't blink. Then my father started to speak, his voice cracking as he admitted to his terrible choices.
Fainting.
I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a father. I saw a stranger who had traded his integrity for a moment of weakness. Is that all? I asked, my voice steady, cutting through his excuses like a blade.
Fuse.
They looked stunned that I had no tears to shed, no arguments to make. I came here to tell you that you are both dead to me, I said, standing up. Not because I'm angry, but because I've already moved on.
Fact.
I walked out of the room, leaving them in the silence they had created for themselves. I didn't look back. The door closed, and this time it stayed shut forever.
Being set.
I walked out to the lobby, where Rachel was waiting, her hand reaching out for mine. I took it, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely unshakably free.
Justice I wanted.
Wasn't an apology. It was the ability to walk away fully whole without them ever being able to touch me again.
Thing.
And that I realized. As we stepped out into the sunlight was the only closure I had ever really needed. Dot. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the suffocating silence of 3 years of deception.
Fashion.
I stared at the two people sitting across from me, their faces etched with the kind of performative sorrow that usually precedes a request for money, not a plea for redemption.
Fecals.
Vanessa looked older, her once vibrant eyes dulled by the weight of her own choices. My father sat beside her, his posture rigid, his gaze fixated on a water stain on the table.
Yusef.
He had always been the man who controlled every room he entered, but today he looked small. Vanessa began, her voice barely a whisper, speaking of regrets and the desperate hope that I had found some semblance of peace.
Each night.
I didn't utter a word. I just watched, letting her shallow apology hang in the air like a rotting branch. Then my father spoke, his voice trembling with a rehearsed sincerity that made my skin crawl.
Fest.
To his betrayals, claiming he lived with the burden of his actions every single day.
Dot.
Again, I remained a statue of indifference.
Ticking clock on the wall.
Seemed to scream, highlighting the seconds they wasted, waiting for me to absolve them.
Dot.
When the silence finally became unbearable, I leaned forward, my voice calm, cold, and final.
Not here for closure.
I began, my eyes locking onto Vanessa's. I found my closure the moment the judge signed our divorce papers. Vanessa reached out, perhaps to touch my hand, but I pulled away.
Be clear about what happened here.
I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the stillness. Dot. Vanessa, you didn't just cheat. You committed paternity fraud.
Fiend.
The color drained from her face as I laid out the wreckage of my life, the sleepless nights. The diapers, the years of believing a boy who wasn't mine was my legacy.
View this.
Because you were confused, I continued, my gaze sharpening. You did it because it was convenient to have a husband who worked hard and didn't ask questions.
I turned my focus to my father.
The man who had taught me about honor while he was actively dismantling my life.
And you? Dot.
I said, his head snapping up to meet my icy stare. You didn't just betray me, you tried to erase me.
Face it.
I reminded him of the times he sat in my living room, offering advice on parenting, while he knew the child I was raising was his own blood. I brought up the phone calls to my clients, the subtle sabotage of my career.
Think.
The way he had tried to paint me as unstable when I started asking the right questions. He flinched, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his face. You talk about the weight you carry? I scoffed.
Buried that weight for months while you played house.
I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor.
Bend.
I don't hate you. And I don't forgive you, I said, looking down at them as if they were strangers I had just met in a waiting room. I simply don't care anymore.
They read it.
I told them that if they ever reached out again, if they dared to darken my doorstep, or if they pulled our mutual friends into their web of lies, I would ensure the law responded on my behalf.
You.
I turned to Patterson, my attorney, and gave a slight nod. We walked out the door, closing behind us with a satisfying final click. The drive back with Lucas was quiet, a comfortable silence that felt like healing.
Thing.
Rachel was waiting for me at home, her smile, the only beacon of reality I needed in a world that had felt like a fever dream.
Feud.
Months bled into a blur of progress, a new project at work, the steady rhythm of planning a future, with a woman who actually looked me in the eye when she spoke.
You.
About a year and a half later, a call from Julie confirmed the inevitable collapse. Vanessa and my father's house of cards had finally imploded. Used to commit to her. She exploded in public, and the resulting drama was as messy and pathetic as I had expected.
Etib.
They had built a life on the foundation of lying to me. It was only a matter of time before they began lying to each other. The following spring, Rachel and I were married on a crisp Saturday in April.
Fat.
The ceremony was small, intimate, and entirely authentic. My mother walked me down the aisle, her presence a stark contrast to the man who should have been standing there.
View.
During the reception, as the glasses clinked and the laughter filled the room, I stood up to address our guests.
Fen.
I looked at the people around me, friends who had stood by me when I had nothing but a broken heart and a pile of legal fees.
Family.
Isn't defined by blood, I said, my voice steady.
Feel.
It is defined by who shows up when you are at your lowest. I spoke about the choice to walk away, to stop trying to please people who saw me as an inconvenience.
Things.
I thanked them for helping me build something real, something that didn't require a mask. The best revenge once making them suffer. I realized then it was living a life that didn't have room for them in it.
Viewed it.
That night, in the quiet of our hotel room, Rachel asked if I had given them a single thought throughout the day. I looked at the woman. I loved the woman who had helped me find my own truth.
Thing.
I said. And for the first time in my life, I knew it was the absolute truth. The glass in my hand felt cool, a stark contrast to the burning intensity of the memories that had haunted me for years.
Thinged.
Around me, the room was filled with the hum of genuine laughter and the clinking of silverware, a sound that finally felt like home.
Fence.
Rachel leaned in her eyes, reflecting the warmth of the candles, and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. We did it, she whispered, her voice a soothing balm over the jagged edges of my past.
Beijing.
Everyone raised their glasses in a toast, the clatter of crystal ringing out like a victory bell for a life reclaimed.
Pent.
Later that night, as we sat in the quiet luxury of our hotel room, the city lights shimmering like fallen stars below us, Rachel turned to me.
Tell me the truth.
She asked, her gaze steady and searching. Did you think about them at all today? I took a long breath, letting the weight of the last 4 years settle before finally letting it go.
Fin.
Not once, I said, and for the first time it wasn't a lie. 4 years ago, I had walked into what I thought was the sanctuary of my bedroom, only to have my entire world disintegrate. The sight of my wife, Vanessa, and my own father, Patterson, together in our bed, was a horror that no amount of time could ever truly erase.
Fixed in.
The betrayal cut deeper than the infidelity. It was the discovery that the little boy I had been raising, the child I adored, was not mine by blood.
Fen.
Everything I had believed in, every promise, every whispered, I love you, had been a cold, calculated fabrication.
Thinked.
Vanessa and my father had built a palace of lies, expecting me to stay trapped in their version of reality while they danced on the ruins of my dignity.
Easy.
They had tried to break me, to force me into a life of complicity and silence, thinking I was weak enough to accept their twisted script. But they had failed.
Failed.
They had failed because I unleashed a storm of rage or fought them with the same venom they used against me.
Failed them.
Because I simply walked away, turning my back on the toxicity and refusing to give them the reaction they craved. I chose to vanish from their orbit, stripping them of the power they thought they held over my soul.
Soul. Faction.
I rebuilt brick by brick, piece by piece, creating something better, something honest, and something that finally belonged to me.
Finch.
I met Rach Shelyul, who taught me that loyalty isn't demanded, it's earned through the quiet consistency of being there. We moved into a house that held no shadows of the past, filled with people who valued integrity over manipulation.
Full.
I looked at my life. Now the peace. The stability, the genuine affection. I realized the true cost of their betrayal was their own loss of me. They chose their path of deceit, and I chose the path of liberation.
Future.
My life as it stands today is infinitely better than anything they could have ever imagined for me. The silence of my past has been replaced by the music of a future I actually want to live in.
Beam Booth.
It was never about revenge. It was about the simple, profound act of letting go of what wasn't meant to be. But the scars remain, but they are no longer bleeding, they are just quiet reminders of how far I have come.
Fisia.
I looked over at Rachel, who was drifting off to sleep, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that led us here.
Phasing.
The ghost of the man I used to be, one, who was constantly looking over his shoulder, has finally been laid to rest. I am finally truly living for myself.
For the first time.
In a long time, the only thing on my mind is the happiness of tomorrow. The end of the old story was just the beginning of a life worth living.
Feuds.
Guys, we are standing on the edge of something incredible, so close to hitting that 1,000 subscriber milestone on this channel. If you haven't joined our community yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button today.
Emem.
It makes a massive difference in helping us reach our goal and continue sharing these stories. Thank you so much for being a part of this dream and for walking this path with me.